It was a still evening, almost unnaturally quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I sat in the living room, the faint hum of the clock on the wall the only sound breaking the silence. My hands cradled a cup of tea, untouched and cooling fast, as my thoughts churned ceaselessly. Melissa was in the bedroom, her voice muffled through the door. I couldn't hear her words, nor did I try to. My mind was consumed by the memory of her earlier confession, a revelation delivered with such an unnerving calmness that it felt almost unreal. "I need to tell you something," she had said earlier that evening. Her tone was flat, her hands clutching at the hem of her shirt. I thought it would be about the house or her work, some mundane issue, but the words that followed shattered that illusion. "I've been unfaithful." For a moment, I was frozen, unable to process what I'd just heard. My wife, Melissa, the woman I'd shared over a decade of my life with, had betrayed me. The words fell into the space between us like stones into a well, creating ripples that reached into every corner of my mind. She started explaining, her voice trembling slightly, but I couldn't make sense of it. The why, the how, none of it mattered in that moment. All I felt was the ground beneath me shifting. The foundation of our marriage cracked open, and I had no idea what lay beneath. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I barely remember what I said in response, but I knew I didn't yell or cry. My emotions were too tightly wound, my pride refusing to let her see just how deep the wound went. She retreated to the bedroom eventually, leaving me alone to grapple with the reality of her betrayal. It was then that the idea began to take shape in my mind, unformed and wild. I wasn't sure what it meant, or what I would do next. But I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let this go unanswered. I barely slept that night. The silence in the house felt like an oppressive weight, pressing down on me with every passing hour. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over in my mind. Morning came too soon. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, but they brought no warmth, no clarity. I was still tangled in a web of anger, disbelief, and humiliation. Melissa emerged from the bedroom, her face pale and drawn. She avoided my gaze as she moved around the kitchen, making coffee like it was any other day. It wasn't any other day. I watched her in silence, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her mug. Maybe she thought we would talk about it later, work through this like some solvable problem. But I couldn't see a way forward. All I could think about was how I felt trapped in a lie, and I couldn't stomach it. "I want you out of this house," I said abruptly, my voice calm but unyielding. Melissa froze mid-motion, the mug clutched in her hand. She turned to me slowly, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" "You heard me," I replied. "I can't look at you right now. I need space to think. You should go." "Jake, she started, her voice breaking, but I cut her off. "You made your choice, Melissa. You don't get to decide how I react to it." Her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she set the mug down carefully, her hands trembling. For a brief moment, I thought she might apologize, plead for forgiveness, but she didn't. She just stared at me, her expression unreadable. "I'll pack some things," she said softly. I nodded and turned away, unable to stand the sight of her any longer. I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway, the sound of drawers opening and closing. Part of me felt a twisted satisfaction that she was finally confronting the consequences of her actions, but another part of me, deeper and quieter, felt hollow. When she came back out, she was holding a small bag, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She stopped by the door, hesitating as though she wanted to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. I stood there, arms crossed, staring at her until she finally walked out. As the door clicked shut behind her, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For a moment, the house was silent again, but this time, it felt different. The tension that had hung in the air was gone, replaced by an emptiness that was almost as unbearable. But even then, I wasn't satisfied. Not yet. After Melissa left, the silence in the house became unbearable. I thought I'd feel a sense of relief, but instead, the emptiness gnawed at me, feeding the anger simmering just below the surface. My thoughts spun in endless circles, replaying every moment of our marriage, trying to pinpoint where things had gone so wrong. By evening, I found myself pacing the living room, the weight of her betrayal heavier than ever. A cruel idea began to take root, one that felt both cathartic and horrifying. Part of me hesitated. Was I really the kind of man who could do something like this? But the other part, the wounded, humiliated part, demanded satisfaction. I called her. Melissa answered on the second ring, her voice hesitant. "Jake. You forgot a lot of your things," I said, my tone sharp. "Come back and get them." There was a pause on the line. "I thought you wanted space." "I've changed my mind," I replied curtly. "But I'm not holding on to your stuff. If you don't want it, I'll toss it out." "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll come by." When she arrived, I was ready. Her knock echoed through the house, and I opened the door slowly, letting her stand on the porch in the cool evening air. She looked uncertain, her bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes searching mine for some hint of forgiveness. Instead, I stepped back, crossing my arms as I gestured toward the bedroom. "Everything's in there." Melissa moved past me cautiously, like she was stepping into hostile territory. As she disappeared down the hallway, I followed at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. The plan I'd formed felt surreal, like it belonged to someone else, but I was too far gone to stop now. When she entered the bedroom, she paused, staring at the scene I'd set up. Her clothes were scattered haphazardly across the bed, her personal items piled high in the middle of the floor. It was a mess, deliberate and unkind. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Take it," I said coldly. "Take it all and get out." Her gaze flickered toward me, her lips trembling. "You're serious?" "As serious as you were when you betrayed me," I shot back, my words laced with venom. "I want you gone, Melissa. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here." Her eyes welled with tears, but I didn't falter. She started gathering her things, her movements shaky but determined. I watched in silence, my emotions warring within me, anger, sadness, guilt. I knew this was cruel, but I couldn't bring myself to care. As she worked, I reached into the closet and pulled out a second bag I'd prepared earlier. It wasn't much, just enough to hold her over for a night. I placed it by the door without a word. Melissa finished packing, her face pale and drawn. "Jake, No," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't want to hear it. Just go." She hesitated for a long moment, then finally picked up the bag by the door. She turned to face me, her expression a mix of regret and sadness. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "Well," I replied, my voice cold and steady, "neither did I." And with that, I closed the door behind her, leaving her alone on the porch as the night swallowed her up. I stood by the door long after she'd left, staring at the empty porch. The house was so still I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen. My heart pounded in my chest, the echoes of our confrontation replaying in my mind. The moment she walked away should have felt like a victory, a statement of my resolve, but instead, it left me with an ache I couldn't quite place. Unable to sit with the silence any longer, I grabbed my car keys and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cool, the faint scent of rain lingering from earlier in the day. I didn't have a destination in mind as I slid into the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I just needed to move, to escape the suffocating stillness of the house. The streets were quiet as I drove through town, the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows on the pavement. My thoughts swirled uncontrollably, each one louder and more chaotic than the last. Had I been too harsh? Should I have given her more of a chance to explain herself? Or had I done exactly what needed to be done? I found myself at the edge of town before I even realized where I was. A small, dimly lit diner sat at the corner of a desolate street, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. I pulled into the parking lot, more out of habit than anything else. This place had always been a refuge for me, a spot to think and regroup. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. An older man sat at the counter nursing a cup of coffee, and a waitress leaned against the far wall, scrolling on her phone. I slid into a booth by the window and stared out at the empty street, the glow of the neon sign casting a faint light across the tabletop. The waitress approached with a notepad in hand. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone casual but not unkind. "You could say that," I muttered. She nodded knowingly, jotting down an order for coffee even though I hadn't asked. A minute later, she placed the steaming cup in front of me and walked away without another word. I wrapped my hands around the mug, the heat seeping into my fingers as my thoughts continued to race. The questions wouldn't stop. How had we gotten here? Was this something I could have prevented? Or was Melissa's betrayal inevitable, the result of years of cracks in a marriage I thought was solid? I thought about her standing on the porch, clutching that small bag, her eyes pleading with me to reconsider. I shook the image from my mind, taking a long sip of the coffee. She had made her choice. Now, I had made mine. As I sat there, the storm inside me began to calm, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. I couldn't take back what had happened, but I could decide what came next. My life was different now, irrevocably changed. And while I didn't yet know what the future held, one thing was certain: it wouldn't include Melissa. The next morning, I woke up feeling slightly less raw but no less certain about the path I'd taken. The anger had receded to a dull throb, leaving behind a simmering sense of resolve. I wasn't going to let Melissa's betrayal go unanswered, not just for me, but for everything we had built, and everything she had chosen to destroy. I spent the day putting my plan into action. I packed the rest of her things into boxes, labeling each one with curt precision. There was no emotion in the process, just a cold efficiency that numbed the ache in my chest. By mid-afternoon, the house looked stark, as though she had never been there. It felt lighter, but also lonelier. I called her around sunset. She answered almost immediately, her voice cautious. "Jake. You left some things behind," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I've packed them up. You can pick them up tonight." "Jake, I really think we should talk," she began, but I cut her off. "There's nothing to talk about," I said firmly. "Just come and get your things." She hesitated but eventually agreed. "Fine. I'll be there in an hour." I hung up before she could say more, my heart pounding as I prepared for what came next. When she arrived, I was ready. This time, I didn't let her inside. I stood at the doorway, blocking her entry, and gestured toward the yard where I had placed the boxes neatly along the edge of the driveway. Melissa's face fell as she took in the sight, her eyes darting back to me. "Jake," she started, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to do this." "I didn't have to do a lot of things," I replied coolly. "But you didn't leave me much of a choice." She took a hesitant step forward, but I didn't move to let her pass. "Can we at least talk about this? I need you to understand." "No," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "I don't need to understand anything. You betrayed me, Melissa. You made your choice, and now you're dealing with the consequences." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't falter. I couldn't. She looked down at the boxes, her hands clenching at her sides. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked quietly. "That's not my problem," I said, crossing my arms. "You should have thought about that before you." I stopped myself, swallowing the rest of the words. I didn't need to spell it out. We both knew what she had done. Melissa stood there for a long moment, her shoulders sagging under the weight of what I'd just said. Finally, she stepped toward the boxes, crouching down to pick up the first one. I watched her silently, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, hurt, and something I couldn't quite name. As she carried the boxes to her car, I noticed a neighbor stepping out onto their porch, their curious gaze lingering on the scene unfolding in my driveway. Another neighbor peeked through their window, the blinds shifting ever so slightly. The small suburban street was waking up to the drama, and I could feel their silent judgment radiating across the distance. Melissa must have noticed too because she suddenly turned to me, her face flushed with humiliation. "You're really going to do this here? Like this?" she hissed. I met her gaze steadily. "I didn't make this choice, Melissa. You did." She stared at me for a moment, then shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe you're this cruel." Cruel. The word stung, but I shoved the feeling aside. "Cruel?" I said, my voice low and measured. "You want to talk about cruel? Let's talk about how it felt to find out that my wife, the woman I've spent over a decade building a life with, decided I wasn't enough for her." She flinched, the words hitting their mark. I saw the guilt flash across her face, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to her car and loaded the last of the boxes into the trunk. When she finished, she stood there for a moment, her back to me, as though trying to summon the courage to say something. Finally, she turned around, her face pale but resolute. "I didn't mean for it to end like this," she said softly. "Neither did I replied. Melissa nodded, her gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before she climbed into her car and drove away. I stood there in the fading light, watching her taillights disappear down the street. A strange emptiness settled over me, a quiet reminder of everything I'd just lost. I went back inside, the silence of the house pressing down on me once more. It felt different now, heavier somehow, as though the weight of what had just happened had seeped into the very walls. I sat down on the couch, my head in my hands, and let out a long, shuddering breath. I had won, I supposed. Melissa was gone, and I had made my point. But as the night stretched on and the house remained quiet, I began to wonder if victory was supposed to feel this hollow. The next few days passed in a blur. I threw myself into work, desperate for a distraction, but even that couldn't stop my mind from wandering. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with memories of Melissa, her laugh in the kitchen, the way she used to hum softly while folding laundry, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I had thought that forcing her out of the house would bring me peace, but instead, it felt like I had opened a wound that refused to heal. Late one evening, as I was sitting on the couch scrolling aimlessly through my phone, I saw something that made my heart stop. A photo had popped up on my social media feed, Melissa, standing in front of a cozy cafe, laughing with a group of friends. Her smile was bright, her eyes sparkling, as though the last few days hadn't touched her at all. The caption read, "New Beginnings." My chest tightened as I stared at the image. Anger flared hot and sudden, but beneath it was something far worse, the sting of insignificance. While I had been sitting here, nursing my wounds, she had already moved on, as though our years together had been nothing more than a fleeting chapter in her life. Unable to shake the image from my mind, I did something I hadn't planned to do, I called Lucas, my brother. He was the only person I felt I could talk to about this, someone who wouldn't sugarcoat things or try to tell me what I wanted to hear. "Jake," he answered after a few rings, his voice groggy. "What's up?" "It's late." "I know," I said, pacing the living room. I need to talk. About Melissa." Lucas sighed heavily, and I could almost hear him sitting up in bed. "What happened now?" "She's gone," I said simply. "I told her to leave." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, that's not surprising, considering what she did. But what's got you worked up?" "She's acting like it doesn't matter," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "Like she's fine, like she's happy. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here, falling apart." Lucas let out a low hum of thought. Jake, look, I'm not saying you don't have a right to feel the way you do. What she did was awful. But you can't expect her to crumble just because you're hurting. People process things differently. I stopped pacing, gripping the phone tighter. You're saying I'm overreacting? No, Lucas replied firmly. I'm saying you're letting her take up too much space in your head. She's out of the house, right? She's not your problem anymore. Don't let her keep living rent-free in your mind. His words stung, but I knew he was right. I thanked him and hung up, but even after our conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. It wasn't just about Melissa's betrayal or the fallout, it was about what came next. The following day, I decided to take Lucas's advice. I threw myself into cleaning the house, scrubbing every surface, rearranging furniture, and even tackling the yard work I'd been putting off for weeks. It was exhausting, but it gave me a sense of control, however fleeting. While clearing out the garage, I stumbled upon a box I hadn't seen in years. It was labeled simply with our names, Jake and Melissa. My stomach churned as I opened it, revealing a collection of keepsakes from our early years together, old photos, handwritten notes, ticket stubs from our first date. I sat down on the cold concrete floor, holding one of the photos in my hands. It was a picture of us at the beach, arms around each other, grinning like fools. It had been taken not long after we got married, back when everything still felt new and unbreakable. For the first time in days, the anger melted away, leaving only a deep, aching sadness. I had loved her. Despite everything, I had loved her with every fiber of my being. And now, all that love felt like a scar, a reminder of what I'd lost. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the contents of the box, but eventually, I forced myself to pack it all back up. I carried it to the curb and set it down with the other trash. When I went back inside, I didn't look out the window again. A few nights later, just as I was settling into the quiet routine I'd begun to carve out, there was a knock at the door. It was late, far later than anyone reasonable would visit. My stomach tightened as I crossed the living room, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. I opened the door to find Melissa standing on the porch, her face pale and drawn. She looked nothing like the woman from the photo I'd seen earlier. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes red-rimmed, and in her hands, she clutched a familiar object, the box of keepsakes I'd left on the curb. I found this, she said quietly, her voice trembling. I couldn't leave it there. I stared at her, a dozen emotions clashing inside me. Anger, pity, regret, they all threatened to surface, but I forced them down. Why are you here, Melissa? I asked, my tone guarded. She hesitated, glancing down at the box. I need to talk to you. Please, Jake. For a moment, I considered slamming the door and walking away, but something in her voice, raw and broken, gave me pause. Without a word, I stepped aside and let her in. Melissa stepped inside hesitantly, clutching the box like a shield. I motioned toward the couch, but she shook her head, standing near the door as though unsure she belonged. The air between us was heavy, thick with words unsaid. She finally broke the silence, her voice shaky. I saw the box, Jake. I saw us. I couldn't just leave it there. I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. Why? It's just stuff, Melissa. Memories of something you decided didn't matter anymore. Her face crumpled, and she clutched the edge of the box tighter. That's not true. She paused, struggling to find the words. I made a mistake, Jake. A horrible, unforgivable mistake. But you have to know it wasn't because I stopped loving you. I laughed bitterly, the sound foreign even to my own ears. Really? Because it sure feels like you threw everything we had away. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't let it sway me. Jake, I was lost. I felt invisible, like I wasn't enough anymore. And instead of talking to you, instead of fixing what was wrong, I did the worst thing I could have done. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I couldn't just leave things like this. Her words landed like punches, but I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I turned away, staring out the window into the night. The stillness stretched between us, a chasm too wide to cross. Finally, I spoke, my voice low. Do you even realize what you've done to me? To us? You didn't just break my trust, Melissa. You shattered it. You took the one thing I thought was unshakable and destroyed it. She set the box down on the floor and took a step closer, her voice cracking. I know. And if I could go back and undo it, I would. But I can't. All I can do is tell you the truth and hope that one day you can see that I'm more than my worst mistake. I turned to face her, my emotions a storm barely held in check. And what am I supposed to do with that, huh? Just pretend this never happened? No, she whispered, her tears falling freely now. I don't expect you to. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. Her sincerity was undeniable, but it didn't soothe the ache inside me. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to her. I hear you, Melissa. But hearing isn't the same as forgiving. She flinched, but she didn't argue. Instead, she wiped her face and picked up the box again. I'll go now, she said softly, her voice barely audible. I didn't stop her as she walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind her echoing in the empty house. For a long time, I stood there, staring at the place where she'd stood, my thoughts swirling. I had wanted her to leave. I had wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done. But as the silence enveloped me once more, I couldn't help but wonder if I had lost more than I had gained. The days that followed were quieter than ever, but not peaceful. Melissa's visit lingered in my mind, her words replaying over and over. I'm more than my worst mistake. I didn't know if I could believe that, but I couldn't deny the sincerity in her voice. It left a crack in the walls I had so carefully built around my anger. One evening, as I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where the box of memories had been, I got a call. It was Lucas. Hey, he said. I've been thinking about you. How are you holding up? I hesitated, not sure how to answer. I'm still figuring it out. He let out a knowing hum. Melissa came by, didn't she? How'd you guess? I asked, leaning back in the chair. She's been reaching out to everyone, Jake. She called me, too. She didn't say much, just that she wanted to make things right with you. I exhaled sharply. And what am I supposed to do with that, Lucas? Just forgive her. Forget what she did. No, he said firmly. But maybe you need to ask yourself what you really want. Is it about holding on to the pain? Or is it about moving forward, whether that's with her or without her? His words hung in the air long after we ended the call. Moving forward. What did that even look like? A week later, Melissa reached out again, this time through a letter. It was handwritten, the kind of effort I hadn't seen from her in years. Her words were raw, unpolished, and painfully honest. She admitted everything, her insecurities, her selfishness, and the choices that had led her to betray me. But she didn't ask for forgiveness this time. Instead, she simply thanked me for the years we'd shared and expressed her hope that I'd find peace, whether or not she was a part of my future. I read the letter 3 times, each pass softening something in me. It didn't erase what she had done, but it reminded me of the woman I had fallen in love with, the one who had flaws but also depth and vulnerability. The woman I had once called my partner. That night, I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at my phone for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I called her. She picked up almost immediately. Jake. Her voice was tentative, as though she didn't dare hope. I got your letter, I said. I'm not ready to forgive you, Melissa. Not yet. But I think we need to talk. The line was silent for a moment, and then she exhaled shakily. "I'd like that. Whenever you're ready." It wasn't reconciliation, and it wasn't a promise of the future. But it was a start, a step toward understanding, if not resolution. And for the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The journey wasn't over. Forgiveness, if it came, would be a long and painful road. But in that moment, I realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant facing the truth, about Melissa, about myself, and about the life we had built, and deciding what came next. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let the past define me anymore.